It was a small town by the sea, the kind of place where the sound of the waves never left your ears. The air always smelled of salt and sun, and every morning began with the cries of seagulls flying over the pier. Life there moved slowly, peacefully, like the tide that came and went. Among the people who called this place home was a quiet girl named Lila. Lila grew up in a small house just a short walk from the beach. Her parents owned a little cafe that faced the shore. It wasn't fancy, but people loved it. Travelers stopped by for a cup of coffee. Fishermen came to warm their hands after long nights, and kids came running in for ice cream during the hot summers. Lila helped her mother every morning, wiping tables, arranging shells and jars by the windows, and serving drinks with a soft smile. What made her different was her love for the sea. While most children treated the beach as a playground, Lila treated it like a living friend. She could sit for hours just watching the waves roll in, her fingers drawing shapes in the sand. She once told her mother, "The sea remembers everything. Even when it washes things away, it keeps them somewhere deep inside." Her mother had smiled, thinking it was just a child's imagination. But as Lila grew, that connection never faded. One summer, a new family moved into town. They rented a small cottage near the cliffs, and among them was a boy around Lila's age named Daniel. He was quiet, almost shy, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much for someone so young. His father was a fisherman too, but new to the coast. Daniel spent most of his days walking alone near the water, watching the boats leave the harbor. One evening, Lila noticed him sitting by the rocks as the tide came in. She walked over and asked, "You like the sea too?" He nodded without looking up. "It's the only place that makes sense," he said softly. She smiled at his answer. It was strange, yet she understood exactly what he meant. That evening turned into the first of many. They started meeting by the shore almost every afternoon. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. They didn't need to. The ocean did most of the talking for them. They collected shells, built tiny sandcastles, and drew pictures that the waves would eventually erase. It became their quiet game, writing messages in the sand and watching the water slowly take them away. Over time, they became inseparable. Daniel would help her carry baskets to the cafe, and she would save him extra pieces of pie after the shop closed. They didn't call each other best friends, but everyone in town knew they were. People often smiled when they saw the two walking along the beach with their footprints side by side. One late afternoon, when the sun painted the sky orange, Daniel picked up a stick and wrote her name in large letters across the wet sand. Lila laughed and said, "The sea will take it away." He looked at her and said, "Even if it does, it'll still be here." And he pointed at his chest. She didn't say anything for a moment, just smiled and looked at the waves curling toward them. It was the first time she realized that maybe what they shared was something deeper than friendship. As the years went by, life in the small town stayed much the same. The cafe got busier, tourists came and went, but Lila's favorite place remained the same piece of beach near the old rocks. Daniel, who used to be shy, grew more confident. He started helping his father on fishing trips and spent long nights out at sea. Every time he came back tired and sunburned, he would stop by the cafe and tell Lila stories about what he saw. The dolphins that followed their boat, the glowing jellyfish at night, the strange sounds from the deep water. She listened like every word was magic. Lila's dream was to study the ocean. She wanted to learn everything about the creatures that lived beneath the waves. She used to say, "If the sea remembers everything, maybe I can learn its language someday." She would spend hours reading about coral reefs and sea currents whenever the cafe was quiet. Her parents supported her dream, though they secretly didn't want her to leave the town. One evening, while walking along the shore, she told Daniel about a university far away that offered marine biology. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke about it. But Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he asked, "So you're leaving?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Only for a while. I'll come back." The next morning, the town was quiet. Lila's acceptance letter had arrived. Everyone congratulated her, but she couldn't shake the thought of leaving everything behind. The cafe, her parents, and most of all, Daniel. When she told him, he didn't try to stop her. Instead, he walked her to the beach at sunset. They sat there until the sky turned dark. Then with a small stick, he drew a heart in the sand and wrote her name inside it. "Promise me," he said, "that you'll come back every year. Same day, same place." She smiled through her tears. I promise." The night before she left, she went to the beach one last time. The moonlight turned the waves silver, and she could hear the faint hum of the tide. She wrote his name beside hers and whispered, "The sea will remember." When the bus took her away the next morning, Daniel stood near the cafe with his hands in his pockets, watching until she disappeared down the road. After that, the beach felt emptier. He still went there every day, sitting in the same spot, watching the sea. The waves came and went, but her laughter was missing from the air. The first year passed slowly. Lila sent letters, long ones filled with stories about her classes, the new city, and how different the sea looked from there. She missed home, she wrote, but she was happy. Daniel kept every letter in a wooden box and read them whenever the nights grew too quiet. When her first birthday after leaving came, she returned. True to her word, she met him on the beach. The years had changed them a little, but the moment they saw each other, it felt like time had never moved. They talked until the tide rose and washed over their feet. It became a tradition. Every year on her birthday, she would return. They would meet at sunset, write something in the sand, and watch it fade together. But even as things seemed perfect, a part of Daniel always feared the day she might not come back. The sea had taught him that nothing stays the same forever. Still, he held on to her promise. One evening, as she prepared to leave again, Lila told him about a research program that would take her to study marine life far out in the ocean. She was excited but nervous. "It's only for a few months," she said, trying to sound sure. He smiled and said, "Then I'll wait here like always." That night, before she left, Daniel wrote her name in the sand again. He didn't know why, but something in him wanted to make sure it stayed there, at least for a while. The tide was gentle, almost as if it didn't want to take it away too soon. He stood there until the water finally reached it and swept it smooth. As he walked home under the dim light of the moon, he whispered the same words he had told her years ago. "Even when it's gone, it's still here." He touched his chest, and the sound of the sea followed him all the way back. The town was quieter after she left again. The cafe still opened every morning, the same smell of coffee drifting through the air, but something felt different. Daniel went about his days like usual, helping his father repair nets, setting out early with the boats, coming back with fish when the sun was high. But no matter how busy he was, his evenings always ended the same way, by the shore, watching the horizon where the sea met the sky. That was their place. He would sit on the same flat rock where they used to talk and draw in the sand. Sometimes he brought along the old letters she had written him. He would read a few lines, then close his eyes, listening to the sound of the waves. He liked to imagine her voice carried in the wind, calling softly over the water. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Life moved slowly, as it always did in their small coastal town. Every now and then, a letter would arrive from her, always written in her careful handwriting. She wrote about her studies, about the ocean life she was learning about, and the people she met on the university campus. Sometimes she included little drawings, fish, shells, even sketches of coral reefs. Her excitement filled every page, and Daniel could almost see her smile in the words. She wrote that she had joined a research project that would soon take her on a small vessel to explore deep-sea coral reefs. It was her dream, and she couldn't stop talking about it. Daniel was happy for her, though a quiet ache followed every time he read her letters. He missed her more than he wanted to admit. But he never told her that. Instead, he always wrote back with encouragement, saying things like, "The sea was made for you," or "I'll be waiting to hear your stories." He didn't know that. His words would soon become a promise he would hold on to for years. The last letter he received from her came on a windy afternoon. He was helping his father mend fishing nets when the postman called out his name. The envelope looked the same as all the others, except the handwriting seemed hurried. The letter was shorter than usual, only a few lines. It said, "We're leaving tomorrow. I'll be gone for a few months. Don't worry about me. I'll write as soon as I can. The sea feels calm, it feels right. I'll come back with stories you won't believe." He smiled when he read it, imagining her excitement. He kept that letter in his box with the others, not knowing it would be the last one. Days passed. Then weeks, and for the first time since she'd left, there were no more letters. Daniel told himself that maybe she was just busy, or maybe the mail was delayed. He went to the post office every few days, asking if anything had come. Each time the answer was the same, nothing. Still he waited. Months later, the whispers began. Fishermen from another port spoke about a storm that had hit the open sea weeks earlier. Some said a research vessel had gone missing. No one in town knew the details. When Daniel heard, his chest tightened, but he refused to believe it. He told himself there were many research ships that it couldn't be hers. She was careful. She would be fine. But deep down, something inside him felt heavy. One morning, her mother came by the cafe holding a postcard. Her eyes were red from crying. The postcard had been mailed from the vessel just before the storm. It showed a picture of blue water and coral reefs with a short message on the back. It said, "Tell Daniel the sea is even more beautiful than we dreamed." That night, Daniel walked down to the beach and stood where they used to stand. The wind was cold, the tide high. He bent down and wrote her name in the sand again, tracing every letter slowly. Then he sat beside it, waiting for the waves to reach him. When they finally did, the water touched the letters and carried them away. He didn't move. He just watched until there was nothing left but smooth sand and the sound of the ocean. The next morning, he went back again. And the next, it became a ritual. Every day at the same time, he wrote her name in the sand. He didn't speak to anyone about it, and no one asked. The town understood. People would see him walking down the beach with a stick in his hand, his steps steady and quiet. They began to leave him in peace. Time moved on, but Daniel stayed caught between the past and the waves. He stopped writing letters. The box of her words stayed in his room untouched. On her birthday, he lit a candle by the shore and watched it flicker in the wind. The sea looked endless that night, dark and mysterious, as if it was hiding secrets deep below. Sometimes he imagined what might have happened. Maybe the storm had carried the ship somewhere far to a place no one could reach. Maybe she was alive, stranded on some distant shore. Or maybe she was part of the ocean now, the sea she had loved so much. The thought broke his heart, yet gave him a strange peace at the same time. He remembered what she once said. The sea remembers everything. Maybe it remembered her. Maybe that was why it kept calling him back. One evening, as the sun was setting, an old fisherman sat beside him. He had seen Daniel come to the same spot every day. The old man didn't say much. After a while, he looked at the water and said, "The sea gives and the sea takes, but it never forgets." Then he walked away, leaving Daniel alone with those words echoing in his mind. That night, Daniel dreamed of her. She was standing at the edge of the water, her hair blowing in the wind, smiling the same soft smile he remembered. She didn't speak, but she raised her hand as if telling him not to be sad. When he woke up, his pillow was wet with tears. The next day, he went to the cafe early and helped her parents clean up before opening. Her mother looked tired but thanked him with a small nod. When she turned away, Daniel noticed a small seashell necklace hanging near the counter. He recognized it instantly. It had been Lila's favorite. He remembered the day she had found it, half buried in the sand. She had said it was her lucky charm. Seeing it there made his chest ache. He picked it up carefully, holding it like something fragile, and her mother whispered, "You can keep it." "She would want you to." He didn't reply. He just nodded, slipped the necklace into his pocket, and walked down to the beach. The tide was low and the sand stretched wide and smooth. The sky was painted with soft pink and gold as the sun began to rise. He knelt down and wrote her name again, the same way he always did. Then he drew a small heart beside it and placed the shell necklace next to it. For a long time he just sat there watching the waves come closer. When the first wave touched the necklace, he didn't move to stop it. He let the sea take it. He whispered softly, "If you're out there, I hope the sea tells you I never stopped waiting." The water washed over his knees and he closed his eyes. That evening, people walking by saw his footprints leading to the shore, and beside them, the faint outline of her name still visible in the wet sand. The tide hadn't taken it completely yet. It lingered like a memory refusing to fade. And from that day on, every year when the same date came, Daniel would return to that beach. He never missed a single time. Rain or shine, calm or storm, he would be there. He would write her name again, letting the sea erase it, and with it, a small piece of his sorrow. The ocean had become his way of talking to her. Even when the town changed and new faces filled the streets, people still whispered about the man who wrote the same name in the sand. Some said it was a love story. Others said it was a promise that never broke. But no one really knew the truth. Only Daniel and the sea did. And the sea, as she had once said, remembers everything. The sea never stopped calling him back. Every evening when the sky turned orange and the waves began to glow under the setting sun, Daniel walked to the same stretch of beach. He carried no phone, no book, just his thoughts. Some days he spoke to the wind softly, as if it could carry his words far enough to reach her. Other days he simply listened to the rhythm of the waves crashing, the sound that had once filled their quiet moments together. Time had moved on for everyone else. The little town had changed bit by bit. The cafe had been repainted, new faces had started working there, and tourists seemed to come more often than before. But Daniel remained the same. He still wore the old bracelet she had once made out of seaweed thread, faded now but strong enough to stay tied around his wrist. People in town respected his silence. They would nod politely when they saw him walking toward the shore, knowing where he was headed. The children had even given him a nickname, the man who writes in the sand. He didn't mind. Every year on her birthday he carried out the same ritual. He would write her name carefully in the sand, light a small candle beside it, and watch the flame dance until the tide came in. Sometimes the candle lasted only a few minutes before the water reached it. Sometimes it flickered longer, like it was trying to stay alive. He never tried to protect it. He let the sea decide when to take it away. One night, after years of silence, he went to see her mother. She still lived in the same small house behind the cafe. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air. When she opened the door and saw him, her eyes softened. "It's been a while," she said. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs. Lila as a child, smiling at the beach, holding shells, standing beside her parents. Her mother had aged, but her hands were still busy, cleaning, arranging, doing small things to keep the silence away. "I never stopped hoping," she said quietly, placing a cup of tea in front of him. "Some nights I dream she's still out there, that maybe she found an island, maybe she's alive somewhere." Daniel looked down, unsure what to say. He wanted to believe that too. For years that hope had kept him going. Her mother reached into a small wooden box and handed him a faded postcard. It was one of the last ones Lila had sent. He already knew what it said, but he traced the words again as if they might change. "Tell Daniel the sea is even more beautiful than we dreamed." He nodded, smiling faintly. "She loved the ocean too much to be gone from it," he said softly. That night, after leaving her house, he went straight to the beach. The moon was full, bright enough to make the wet sand shimmer. He wrote her name again, but this time he wrote it twice, one below the other, as if doubling it might bring her closer. Then he sat for a long time, staring at the horizon where the moonlight touched the waves. The tide came in, slow and gentle, washing away the letters like it always did. But something about that night felt different. He didn't feel the same ache he usually did. Instead, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. Maybe the sea was telling him something. Maybe it was time to listen. In the days that followed, Daniel began to help around the cafe again. He fixed shelves, painted the porch, and sometimes helped serve customers when it got busy. The locals were happy to see him back among them. Even the tourists, who didn't know his story, noticed the kindness in his eyes when he spoke about the sea. One afternoon, a group of children came running into the cafe after playing near the beach. "We saw something," one of them shouted. "There's a bottle with paper inside. It washed up by the rocks." Curious, Daniel followed them outside. They led him to the edge of the beach where a small glass bottle lay tangled in seaweed. Inside, a rolled-up piece of paper was sealed tight with wax. He picked it up carefully, his heart suddenly beating faster. He unscrewed the cap and pulled out the paper. The writing was faded, smudged by water, but a few words were still clear enough to read. "The sea remembers. I am where the light meets the deep." He froze. The handwriting was hers. There was no doubt. It was her style. The little curves at the ends of letters, the way she dotted her eyes. He stared at it for a long time, unsure what to think. Could it really have drifted here from her ship, or had it been carried by the currents from some distant shore? Word spread quickly through the town. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was fate. But Daniel said nothing. He just folded the note gently and placed it inside his box with all her letters. That night, when he wrote her name in the sand, he whispered, "I got your message." After that day, something inside him began to heal. He still missed her, but the pain no longer felt sharp. It was softer, almost like the sound of the waves, always there but comforting. He started spending more time helping fishermen again, going out to sea when the weather allowed. Being out there, surrounded by endless blue, made him feel close to her. He would close his eyes and imagine her laughter echoing through the wind. One afternoon, while they were out at sea, an older fisherman pointed toward the horizon and said, "Look there." Daniel turned and saw a small island in the distance, one he had never noticed before. It was little more than a strip of land with a few palm trees barely visible. That island appeared after the last storm, the fisherman said. The tides must have shifted the sands. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Something about it caught his attention, an unexplainable pull like the sea itself was guiding him. When they returned, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, he borrowed a small boat and set out alone. The water was calm, the air light. As he neared the island, he saw seashells scattered across the shore, glistening under the sun. He stepped out and walked along the sand, feeling an odd sense of peace. Then he saw it. Near a cluster of rocks, written faintly in the sand, were the same words from the bottle, "The sea remembers." His breath caught in his throat. He looked around, half expecting someone to appear. But there was no one, only the sound of waves and the whisper of wind through the trees. He knelt down and touched the words gently as if they were sacred. He stayed on that island until sunset, watching the sky turn gold and red. Before he left, he took a small shell and put it in his pocket. When he returned home, he placed it on the windowsill beside her letters. From that day on, he stopped asking questions. He didn't wonder how the note had found him, or who might have written those words in the sand. He simply believed that somehow, in some way, the sea had carried her voice back to him. Years passed, but Daniel's devotion never faded. Every year on her birthday, he still went to their beach. He still wrote her name in the sand. But now when the tide came to wash it away, he didn't feel sadness. He felt gratitude, because he knew the sea was keeping her story safe. And maybe, somewhere beneath those endless waves, she was still watching, smiling at the man who never stopped writing her name, the one who believed in the ocean's memory as much as she once did. The town still spoke of him often. To newcomers, he was just an ordinary man with kind eyes and sun-worn skin, but to those who had lived there long enough, he was part of the legend, the story of love, loss, and a name the sea would never forget. And every time someone stood on that beach at sunset, watching the waves curl over the sand, they could almost see it. The faint letters of her name, written by the tide fading slowly back into the sea. Years went by, and Daniel's hair began to turn gray. His face carried soft lines from years spent in the sun, and his eyes had that calm, faraway look of someone who had spent half a lifetime listening to the ocean. He was no longer the young man who once waited by the shore, but the sea still felt like his closest friend. The small town had changed. New houses were built. The cafe now had bright blue walls, and a new generation had taken over the harbor. Still, some things never changed. The waves kept their rhythm, the gulls kept circling above, and Daniel still walked down to the beach every evening at sunset. He had turned his quiet love for the sea into something useful. Tourists who came to visit often asked him questions about the tides, the shells, and the different colors of the water. So he began offering small tours. Nothing fancy, just gentle walks along the shore where he told stories about the ocean. People loved listening to him. There was something peaceful in his voice, something that made them slow down and breathe. He never mentioned her by name, not to anyone. But sometimes, when he spoke about how the sea carried memories, his tone would soften, and listeners could sense that his stories came from a place of love and loss. He told them about how the tide never forgets, how every wave carries whispers of the past. People would listen quietly, the sound of the waves filling the silence between his words. One day, near the end of summer, a young woman came to the cafe asking for him. She was not from the town. Her clothes and voice showed she had come from far away. When she finally found him by the beach, she hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Are you the man who writes names in the sand?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up, surprised but not alarmed. He smiled faintly. "I suppose that's what they call me now." The woman smiled back. "I've heard your story from some locals. I wanted to meet you." She carried a small pendant in her hand, a seashell, silver at the edges, worn smooth by time. When she held it out, Daniel froze. It was the same shape, the same curve, the same size as the one Lila used to wear. He stared at it, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. My brother found it, she said. He's a diver. He was part of a team exploring a reef far from here. They found what looked like parts of an old research vessel deep below. Most of it was gone, but they found some personal things. This pendant was among them. She paused, watching his face carefully. They also found something else. A waterproof notebook. Most of the pages were damaged, but a few were still readable. Daniel's heart began to race. His hands trembled slightly. What did it say? The woman took a deep breath. The last page had a few words written in pencil. It said, "Tell him the sea remembers." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the waves filled the space between them. Daniel's eyes glistened as he looked toward the horizon, his throat too tight to speak. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing her voice back to him after all those silent years. The woman placed the pendant in his hand. "I think it belongs to you," she said gently. He closed his fingers around it and nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea what this means." That evening, after she left, he went to the beach like he always did. But this time he carried the pendant with him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. The tide was low, leaving a wide stretch of smooth sand waiting for him. He knelt down, holding the pendant tightly, and began to write her name again. Each letter felt heavier this time, like he was writing it not just in the sand, but in his heart, all over again. When he finished, he placed the pendant beside the name and sat there in silence. The waves moved closer, slow and patient, as if they knew what he was waiting for. When the first wave touched the edge of her name, he whispered, "You kept your promise." He watched as the sea reached out and gently covered the pendant, then the letters, until everything disappeared beneath the foam. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something lift from his chest. Not sadness exactly, but peace. The kind that comes when you finally understand that love never really leaves, it just changes form. After that evening, he became quieter, but lighter too. People in town noticed it. His smile came easier, his laughter softer but real. He still went to the beach every day, but now he didn't always write her name. Sometimes he just sat and talked to the sea like an old friend, telling it about his day, his memories, his dreams. One morning, the same young woman returned to town. She told him that her brother and his team had planned another dive to the same area. They wanted to mark it as a protected site because it had become a home for sea life. "If you want," she said, "we can take something of hers or yours to leave there. Something to stay with the ocean." Daniel thought for a moment. Then he went back to his small home and returned with a small wooden box. Inside were all the letters Lila had written him, the ones that had traveled miles and years. He had kept them safe all this time. He handed the box to her gently. "Let the sea keep them," he said. "That's where they belong." Weeks later, when the divers returned to the site, they placed the sealed box near a coral arch. They said the water was clear that day, and light streamed down in golden beams. Fish swam around the coral, and it felt like the ocean itself was breathing peacefully. When Daniel heard about it, he simply smiled and said, "Then she's finally home." The town began telling the story in whispers again. It became part of the local legend, the man who wrote a name in the sand for years and the sea that answered him back. Children who grew up near the coast knew it by heart. Some even tried writing their own names in the sand, pretending the sea might remember them too. Daniel grew older, his walk slower, but his spirit gentle and calm. Every time someone new asked him about the ocean, he would smile and say, "It remembers more than you think." On quiet evenings, when the tide came in soft and the air smelled of salt and wind, he could almost hear her voice again, soft, distant, full of life. It wasn't a haunting sound, but a comforting one, like a memory replaying in the rhythm of the waves. And though the years had taken much from him, they could never take the one thing that mattered most, the love he had carried and the promise that had outlasted time. One late evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, Daniel walked to the beach one last time. The sky was glowing with a fiery red light and the water shimmered like molten glass. He knelt down, pressed his palm against the cool sand and whispered her name. Not out loud, just enough for the sea to hear. Then he sat there watching the tide roll in, the same way he always had. The next morning, when people passed by, they found his footprints leading to the edge of the water, and beside them, written clearly in the sand, was her name, untouched as if the tide had chosen to leave it. The waves were calm that day, as if the sea itself was keeping watch. And for everyone who came to that beach afterward, they said the same thing. The air felt different there, softer, peaceful, like the sea really did remember. The years that followed Daniel's last walk to the sea passed quietly, yet his story lived on through the people who had known him. The little coastal town where he had spent most of his life became known for its gentle beauty and the quiet magic that seemed to live along its shore. Visitors often came not just for the waves or the sunset, but for the story, the one everyone knew but told in their own way. It started as whispers, then grew into something more. Some said that Daniel had become part of the sea he loved so much. Others believed the ocean had taken him because his heart belonged to it. No one really knew what happened that final evening. All they found the next morning were his footprints in the sand, leading to the edge of the water, and her name still there, untouched by the tide. People tried to explain it. Maybe the sea had been calm enough that night. Maybe the wind hadn't been strong. But those who had lived there long enough didn't look for reasons. They believed the sea had kept his last message safe, just as it had carried hers all those years ago. The cafe owner, an old friend of Daniel's, kept his table by the window exactly the way it had always been. He cleaned it every morning and placed a small seashell on it. For the storyteller, he would say whenever anyone asked. Sometimes travelers would sit there, order a cup of coffee, and listen to the sound of the waves outside. And if they listened closely, they could almost imagine Daniel's calm voice telling another story about the ocean. One summer, many years later, a young man came to town with a notebook in hand. He was a writer, looking for a quiet place to finish his book. He had heard of the man who wrote names in the sand and wanted to see where the story began. When he arrived at the cafe, the owner greeted him with a warm smile. "You've come for the story," the old man said, as if he already knew. The writer nodded. "Yes, I've heard a little about it, but I want to understand why it means so much to people." The owner poured him a cup of coffee and pointed toward the beach. "Go there," he said. "Sit by the rocks at sunset. You'll feel it." The writer followed his advice. As the sun lowered itself toward the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and rose, he sat on the cool sand. The waves rolled in softly, leaving behind foamy traces that disappeared almost instantly. For a long time he sat there in silence. Then, just before the sun vanished completely, something caught his eye. A faint outline in the sand right where the water met the shore. It was a name. The same name from the stories, faint but visible. He blinked, wondering if the wind had played a trick on him, but the letters stayed, perfectly shaped, untouched by the tide. He sat there for hours, watching, but the waves never took it away. The next morning he went back to the cafe and told the owner what he had seen. The old man only smiled and said, "That's how it always is. For those who come with an open heart, the sea shows what it remembers." The writer stayed in town for a few weeks. During that time, he spoke to the locals, fishermen, children, shopkeepers. Each of them told him a piece of the same story, but differently. One said Daniel had been a quiet man who found peace in the waves. Another said he had loved a woman who disappeared at sea, and his devotion had outlasted time itself. A child said the sea had kept her name because it loved them both. The writer took notes every night, trying to capture what made this story so alive. But he soon realized it wasn't just a story about love or loss, it was about memory. About how some people, no matter how much time passes, never really leave. On his last day in town, the writer went to the beach again. This time he brought a small jar and filled it with sand from the spot where he had seen the name. He told himself it was to remember the feeling, the quiet peace, the soft wind, the sound of the sea whispering old secrets. Years later, when his book was published, it carried a dedication on the first page. For the man who wrote a name in the sand, and the sea that never forgot. The book became quietly famous. Readers from around the world connected with the story's message, that love, when true, leaves traces that even time cannot wash away. Some cried, some smiled, and some traveled to that little coastal town just to see the place where it all began. The town changed again over time. The cafe got a new coat of paint, the harbor expanded, and tourists arrived more often. But the beach stayed the same, peaceful, endless, timeless. People would walk there and write names in the sand, of those they missed, of those they loved, of those they hoped to see again. Some would wait, just like Daniel once did, watching the tide come in, wondering if the sea might leave their names untouched too. Local children grew up hearing the story. Their parents told them that if they ever wrote a name in the sand with love, the sea might keep it safe for a little while. It became a tradition. On calm evenings, when the sunset turned the ocean red and gold, families would gather on the beach, each tracing names, initials, or small hearts. And when the waves rolled in, they watched together, smiling through tears, believing that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone was listening. Every now and then, visitors found something else along that beach: little seashell pendants, pieces of driftwood carved with initials, or even bottles with faded notes inside. It was as if the ocean itself had started returning gifts, small reminders that it remembered everything entrusted to it. One evening, decades later, a storm rolled in. The waves grew wild. The wind howled through the town, and everyone stayed indoors. When morning came, the beach looked different. The sand had shifted, the shoreline had moved slightly, and the rocks had new shapes. People went down to clean up and see what had washed ashore. Among the seaweed and broken shells, someone found something strange: a small wooden box, smooth and darkened by time. Inside it were letters, still sealed tight. The ink was faded, but the words were still visible. They were love letters written in careful handwriting. On the topmost one, a few words were still clear. "If you ever find this, know that love never ends. It just changes shape." The people who found the box brought it to the cafe, and soon the whole town gathered to see it. They realized it was Daniel's, the same box he had given to the divers years ago to leave in the sea. Somehow, after all that time underwater, it had returned to the very place it had come from. No one could explain how or why, but no one needed to. They placed the box in a glass case in the cafe beside his old table, with a small sign that read, "He loved, and the sea remembered." As years turned into decades, the story became part of the town's identity. Schools taught it to children, artists painted it, and couples visited to write each other's names in the sand. Even when technology changed everything else, people still came for the same reason: to feel something real, something lasting. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the tide is just right, locals say you can still see the faint outline of her name glowing under the moonlight. Not every night, only on the calmest ones when the sea seems to rest. And if you stand there long enough, you might hear it too: the soft murmur of waves that sound almost like words. They say it's the sea whispering to the shore, keeping its promise to remember. Because some stories don't fade. Some names, once written in love, remain forever, etched not just in memory but in the sand, in the wind, and in the heart of the sea itself.